Did you know that the original Psycho author Robert Bloch wrote a big old screw you to Hollywood that aired all his frustrations out on slashers? Well, buckle up because this is a weird story behind Psycho 2 the book and Psycho 2 the movie. For context, before the smash hit movie that changed the horror genre forever, Psycho started out as a novel by Robert Bloch. Prior to Psycho, Bloch was a well-regarded writer of pulp fiction and is notable for being friends with H.P. Lovecraft, who encouraged the young writer's talent. And he was talented. He won a Hugo Award for his short story, The Hellbound Train, published in 1958, as well as some other really well-regarded short stories. However, despite having a degree of fame, he was by no means a household name. This would all change with 1959 Psycho, which of course became a bestseller and huge movie. Now, normally this is where I would sum up the plot, but everybody kind of knows about the Bates Motel, Norman, Mother, and the twist ending. And don't even get me started about how millions of people got creeped out by just taking a shower. This is because in 1960, Alfred Hitchcock, already well regarded as the master of suspense, would take the novel and its infamous shower scene and craft something truly iconic. Made on a low budget, the film would gross over $50 million and is still making money from merchandise, video sales, and re-releases. Now, whether or not Psycho was the first slasher or a proto-slasher is up for debate, but what isn't is the fact that flash forward to 1981 and the splatter genre is making a killing at the box office. This is the landscape in which Psycho 2 the novel was born. After Psycho was a huge hit at the box office, Robert Bloch suddenly saw that Hollywood came knocking, as taglines like "From the author of Psycho" was worth its weight in gold. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Bloch would pen cult classics like Straight Jacket and The Night Walker for William Castle, and the incredibly underrated horror anthology Asylum. On the small screen, he would also lend his talent to shows like Hitchcock Presents, Night Gallery, and Star Trek, among others. But he was also churning out stuff like The Skull, The Psychopath, and The Deadly Bees. By the time of Psycho 2 the book, Bloch was pretty much done with Hollywood, and his IMDb credits after this point is all characters by credits or credits for earlier short stories. Though he was of course still writing. I mention his time in Hollywood because this definitely reflects Psycho 2 the novel and its plot. In the book, we see Norman Bates is living in an asylum after the events of the first book. However, during a dark and stormy night, Norman escapes and heads to Fairville, where Marion Crane's sister Lila and Sam, now married, live. In the B-plot of the book, a movie about the first book is in production, and the production wants Norman's doctor, Dr. Claiborne, to act as a consultant to help give the movie some credibility, which leads him to Hollywood. And well, that's all I'm going to say because I don't want to spoil it. However, I didn't really like the book, and I might do a full review of that book in another video, but I'm sorry, but it's not very good. Now, the book is cynical, and when I say cynical, I mean deeply cynical. Like, Bloch seems to view Hollywood as some modern day Sodom and Gomorrah, and slashers as the very worst thing to ever happen to mankind. Think the moral panic of Siskel and Ebert, who thought the bulk of the horror genre was trash. Universal, the owner of the Psycho IP, was keen on reviving the brand, especially since Hitchcock at this time had recently passed away, and his work was receiving new critical appraisal and attention. Obviously, the studio was keen on Bloch delivering a book they could adapt whilst also using his name in the marketing. However, what Bloch delivered to the studio was a big ol' middle finger, as the entire book denigrates the modern film business. Furthermore, the studio no doubt wanted a slasher this time around, and Bloch's Psycho 2 is very clear on its anti-slasher genre stance. Now, doing some research via interviews, Bloch never seemed to come off jaded about his time in Hollywood in general. In fact, he would go to conventions and fan events, give interviews, and always talked fondly about Hitchcock and his adaptation of Psycho. Yet, Psycho 2, the novel, was basically the very opposite of what Universal wanted. They decided to go in a totally new direction. The script was written by Tom Holland, who would go on to write classics like Fright Night and, of course, Child's Play. Richard Franklin would step into the director's chair. The Australian-born director was a big fan of Hitchcock, and his film Road Games was a loving homage to the late master of suspense. So it seemed like a natural fit that he would get to direct a follow-up to one of Hitchcock's most famous films. Psycho 2 was released June 3rd, 1983, and on a budget of $5 million. The movie did rather well at the box office, grossing $35 million, and while the reviews were mixed, some critics definitely really enjoyed it at the time. However, in more recent years, the film has found a really big fan base, myself included. On his hit album, the Slim Shady LP, Eminem even references Psycho 2 in the track Role Model. As sequels goes, it does indulge in the slasher craze. However, Holland and Franklin craft a fitting tribute to Hitchcock, Bloch's Psycho, and expands the story in some really interesting ways. Still, I always wondered what if Bloch's version of Psycho 2 was made instead. I can see a world where a streamlined version, which retained that meta-satirical elements, could have made for a really fun and wild ride. Robert Bloch passed away in September of 1994 at 77. His legacy will always be tied to Norman Bates, yet the writer was never personally bitter by this. In fact, from all accounts, he loved meeting fans, talking about Psycho, and his relationship with H.P. Lovecraft. Bloch didn't hate Hollywood, he just didn't like where he thought it was going. Ironically, in the wake of more psychologically driven horror of modern times, Bloch's idea of less is more horror is very hot right now, as is the meta-commentary angle. It's unlikely that Bloch's vision for Psycho 2 will ever see an adaptation, big or small, but I think the time is certainly right for it. So I hope you all enjoyed that video, and if you did, please consider giving this a like, subscribe. I try to put out videos at least once a week. If you still want to check out some other of my videos, here is a playlist, and I will see y'all in the next one.